Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. I am Robert Stanley. Today we will be discussing John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism.
It's the Right to Reason podcast.
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
Suppose the listener is not familiar with Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill or the concepts of utilitarianism. Evan, why don't you give us your rundown, your explanation, as it were, of utilitarianism, the pros and cons that you have with it, and then Dan, if you don't mind following up with the same.
The modern founder is Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham defined utilitarianism as the supreme principle of ethics, as the most pleasure for the most number of people. Bentham then argued that everything revolves around the principle of utility. This is expanded into people like John Stuart Mill that grow utilitarianism in different ways, and continues today with people like Peter Railton and Peter Singer that argue for the most happiness for the most number of people. By far, the biggest plus is that this is an easy system to understand. It is easy to put yourself in this ethical system and to actually work it out. The goal is clear. The goal is intuitive in that most people value their own happiness as well as the happiness of others. The main limitation is that it only values happiness. And so other values, such as beauty or truth, are going to be pushed aside for the sake of happiness. And that kind of limit is ultimately why people still are going to break with utilitarianism.
That's all accurate what Evan said, and I would just situate utilitarianism in a larger context. There are several broad approaches to foundations of morality, and among them, there are those that are consequentialist in nature. And consequentialisms are views of ethics that say that the moral action is always the one that maximizes the good or minimizes the bad, or some combination of maximizing the good and minimizing the bad. And that's a broader concept than utilitarianism. It's a notion that actions are judged by their consequences, their effects, broadly. Now, what kinds of consequences, what kinds of effects is a separate question. And utilitarians tend to think that subjective satisfactions of some sort are the kinds of consequences that should be prioritized above all else. Typically, that means maximization of pleasures, but it could also mean maximization of preference satisfactions. In other words, people getting what they want. And economists tend to be utilitarians of that sort. Within consequentialism, there are other options than utilitarianism. There's other options of other goods that could be either co-equal with satisfaction of preferences or pleasure states. There could be other goods that we think of as ultimately good on a same level with those, or there could be other candidates for the ultimate good. So someone could say, as I'm more inclined to do, that the ultimate good is the thriving of rational persons. The consequentialist will take any particular moral action or any action in general and ask, in this action, what way to perform this action, or among the choices of actions, which action is going to create the most good? That's the one that's preferable. If you have a utilitarian, what they're typically going to say is what makes every moral action good is the fact that it maximizes pleasure. What makes every action evil is the fact that it increases pain in the world, or that's the kind of action that would tend to increase pleasure or tend to increase pain. And that's the thing that makes the action good or not. Is the making of pleasure or pain, or this is the action that will involve the maximization of preference satisfactions. That could be another candidate. Now, so alternative consequentialisms would say that a different fundamental good is what satisfying a different fundamental good is what made every action good or bad. And then contrary to that, we could say that you don't reduce the goodness of actions morally. What makes them good ultimately, or what makes bad actions bad ultimately, is not the fact that it creates a further consequence, but that actions have inherent characters to them, that there's something inherently wrong about cheating, for example, that has to do with the nature of a contest and what it is to meaningfully win a contest. And even if it made people happier that a particular person or team won a contest, it would still be wrong to do it by cheating, because there's a different way we assess that action. It has to do with the structure and nature of contests and the way that those are ruined and perverted by cheating, irrespective of any consideration of whether everyone's happier at the end or not. And so there are certain sorts of formalistic considerations, and often you get these from deontological thinkers, or we class these as deontological views, that say that actions, what makes them right and wrong has something to do with the integrity of an action, the logical nature of your action. Are you contradicting yourself? Are you being a hypocrite? Are you acting in a way that's not universalizable and systematizable in society? Those sorts of concerns, I think, are very, very powerful, and I've been very, very persuaded in that more formalistic direction in thinking about actions. And that's one of my criticisms of utilitarianism. So one of the criticisms is that not everything is about consequences and morality. It's about integrity to our actions and that they make sense. And then the other thing that pushes me away from utilitarianism is that insofar as I am a consequentialist, and I do think that there's a concern for maximizing the good, I don't like the subjectivist emphasis of utilitarianism on our subjective pleasure states or preference satisfactions, rather than considerations of what's objectively good for us from a third person standpoint, where we might be wrong about what our preferences should be, what we might not be taking pleasure in the right things. I think we can have really substantive discussions about what's objectively good for us. And so those are my two major differences with utilitarian.
How could something be inherently wrong? Like, where is this inherence coming from, right? So this is my objection here, is that with utilitarianism, we have the benefit of hindsight 2020, right? We have the benefit of looking back and going, did that work out for all of us in the best way that it could? But whenever you start talking about objective morals, which I can agree with objective morals, I think Evan can as well, Dan, but when you start talking about objective morals as something inherently specific to humanity, I start feeling like you have to define the source of that morality. And I don't think you or I would dare to claim a source. Evan may. Evan is a believer of Jesus Christ. Is that right, Evan?
That's very true.
So Evan might agree with you even more than I would, but I really have a problem whenever you talk about the inherency of ethics. Well,
it would take me a while to lay out my whole meta-ethics, but what we can do is we can start with that simple example of cheating, right? Like, I give this thought experiment I've been kicking around to illustrate this, is let's say that we rewind back to 2016, the Cubs finally won the World Series for the first time in 108 years.
Those bastards! Go ahead.
And in this time until then, right, you had this one franchise of fans, the baseball team that had been around for well over 100 years, and they hadn't won a World Series in well over 100 years. And they have these devoted fans who are deeply invested in their team, and many people have lived decades and decades following this team without the taste of the World Series victory. And it's an amazing story when a team that's hasn't won in over 100 years finally wins again. It's a huge national story. It grips the imagination, and many, many people root for underdogs. Now, in fact, the Cubs, when they won that World Series, they won against the Cleveland Indians. But let's say they hadn't won against the Cleveland Indians. Let's say instead they'd been up against the dreaded New York Yankees, who have 27 world championships. And so their fans are spoiled with victories, right? And many people around the country hate them because they're so dominant, and it's boring when the Yankees win another World Series. Right. So let's just stipulate, just for argument's sake, let's just say for argument's sake that it's just unambiguous. The world would be a far happier place if the Cubs beat the dreaded Yankees to win the World Series. Like, that would be an amazing story. Everybody would love it. It'd be like a storybook to have it be against the Yankees. All these people who'd never gotten to win, the pleasure would be so much sweeter than if the Yankees won. So let's just say, for argument's sake, the world's way happier if the Cubs win. So if that was true, would we say that the ethical thing to do for the Yankees is to sit down. Let's say the game goes to the last game, Game 7. It's a tied series. It's do or die. Would the ethical thing be for the Yankees to sit down in the clubhouse and go, well, the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers on the line here, and the world's going to be a much happier place if we just lose, and throw the game. And let's say they do it imperceptibly. No one ever finds out and gets disappointed. They're just really good at lying, and they're subtle about the way that they cheat in the Cubs' favor, and they just throw the game. No one ever finds out. The world's a happier place. It seems like, if you're like me, you have a very strong intuition that that's just wrong, and it has nothing to do with because of God. Right? It has nothing to do with because of anything mysterious. It just has to do with the fact that it doesn't mean the same thing to win by cheating or to win by the other team throwing the game that it means to win by actually playing better. And the Cubs' whole victory, to be meaningful, to be what it's supposed to to have an integrity as a genuine win, requires that there not be cheating. Because it has nothing to do with some, we can talk about the ultimate source of grounding of morality in nature, and I am a naturalist, and I think that there is objective goodness, and I think that these are concepts we can actually defend, and there's no need for any sort of supernaturalism for that. It's a perfectly ordinary concept that we see all throughout our dealings with nature. And what I want to say is that one of the ways we can get at it is we can understand the structures of actions and understand that what's wrong about cheating isn't that it makes people unhappy. Cheating can make people happy. What's wrong about cheating isn't that it makes the world a less happy place, like the Cubs example that I came up with can clearly do that. What makes cheating wrong is that it makes the action of winning meaningless, right? It destroys the integrity of the game. And it's important in our actions. The way we actually reason about moral situations frequently has to do with this integrity to the things we're doing. Are we ruining the very activity we're engaged in by doing it in this way? That's how we actually reason about a striking number of scenarios. We don't actually just bean count pleasure results or pain results.
I think it would even make it more visceral if we were to add in, what if some sort of state entity or religious / government entity, right? Some form of theocracy were to be controlling that morality. They would then go into the Yankees locker room and say, hey guys, it would be better for the populace, for the state, if you threw the game. That's disgusting, right? That really focuses in on exactly what you're talking about in a way that we can even look at and go, hey, I don't like this authoritarian system. But if we're really going to be true Mills fans, we would have to say, well, if that authoritarian position is best for everybody, then we need to, pay our taxes. We need to go ahead and submit to that willpower. We need to make sure that the Yankees lose. That's kind of gross to me.
If we're strictly concerned with the most pleasure for the most number of people, then requiring the Yankees throw the game subversively is exactly what we should be doing. John Stuart Mill might have an out, though. His out would come through higher pleasures. So one of Mill's famous distinction is higher and lower pleasures. So he still says, just like all the rest of the utilitarians, that the most pleasure to the most number of people is precisely our goal. But he instead defines pleasure into two categories. There's two kinds of pleasures, two qualities of pleasures, higher and lower. And the higher pleasures are a kind of pleasure, a separate quality of pleasure that are worth more than any amount of lower pleasure. And so he might be able to argue that kind of authoritarian coercion rips away higher pleasures of the Cubs authentically winning the game for themselves, as opposed to the game being thrown subversively. That kind of out might actually make Mill a better candidate for that kind of scenario.
Yeah, didn't he say something? I want to recall that it was in On Liberty, where he said that like the most happiest pig was not actually as happy as the most miserable human, or something along those lines.
That's chapter 2 of Utilitarianism by Mill.
Oh, you are so good. All right, help me out with that.
So he says, it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So it is better to be an unhappy, rational human being than to be a very happy pet, simply because the rational human being has the higher pleasures.
We could expand that and say, well, in a system where we start cheating, where we start saying that the Yankees have to lose to the Cubs, that violates a bigger theme of happiness for the society, for humanity, for the sports fans, as it were. Therefore, that really didn't meet the goals of Mill's utilitarianism. So at any point along the way, he still isn't wrong.
So specifically, it's that it would violate a specific kind of pleasure that he is most concerned with. That's the official way to get around it through higher pleasures.
But hold on, Evan. And Dan, chime in when you feel appropriate, but it's not what he's not saying what he feels to be superior pleasures. He's saying whatever the objective opinion of humanity is. It seems like he's giving himself an out. No matter where you go, this guy can't fail. Because if you say, I want to give a kidney from an old person to a young girl when she needs one, well, that might be utilitarian on the surface, but a society that violates bodily autonomy doesn't bring the most happiness to the society. So even though that might make the little girl happy, that doesn't make the society happy. Carry it on as you would. Utilitarianism still comes up unscathed, gentlemen. Correct me.
Well, the issue is, and I agree that Mill is quite right, I think, in making a distinction between higher and lower pleasures. I think that's a very valuable distinction. The way I often kind of illustrate it is to say, like the way Mill thinks this works is that the higher pleasure, you can tell which one that is, in that anyone who's experienced it would not give up on that kind of pleasure altogether, even for unlimited sums of the other sorts. So the example I give is that if you've had the pleasures, he notes pleasures like responsibility, individuality, freedom, responsibility, these exercises of your agency, the intellect, so your ability to experience intellectual pleasures, the pleasures of taking responsibility and being successful at that, the pleasures of being a free person. If you had those pleasures, you wouldn't give them up even for unlimited quantities of the other sorts. Like if you had some extraordinarily wealthy person come to you and say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the full life of the pig in human form. I'm gonna let you live in the lap of luxury, and I'm gonna let you, you're going to be able to eat whatever you want. We're going to hedonistically party. There's going to be lots of opportunities for meaningless sex. But here's what you can't have. You don't have any freedom. You go where we say. You're just going to be a slave here. You're going to be comforted. You're going to be you're going to live in luxury, and you're going to be part of these parties we're going to have. But here's the rules. You don't read anything. You're not allowed to talk about anything related to philosophy, politics. You're not allowed to engage in charity work. You're not allowed to take any sort of responsibilities. You can't run a business. You can't have a family. What you can do is eat to your heart's content. You can have sex to your heart's content. You can take all the drugs you want. You can party. You can dance. You can luxuriate on fine couches. You're going to tour the world, but you're not allowed to read. You're not allowed to talk about ideas at all. And you're not allowed to take any responsibilities or have any larger purposeful mission in life. Take away those higher pleasures of agency, of impact, of the intellect, but you can have all these lower pleasures, right? Like the point is, Mill thinks nobody who's had the experience of having the world of ideas, who's been responsible, who's been free, would make that deal. Because those pleasures, of being able to be an agent, to be able to be a thinker, to be able to try and make an impact and be responsible for things, those sorts of, and to run your own life, those things matter more than all the food, sex, and drugs and partying in the world, right? And so I think that that's helpful for distinguishing higher and lower pleasures, but it doesn't tell us why cheating is wrong. It might tell us, for example, that it would feel worse to find out you won through somebody else cheating. But the reason that it feels bad, the reason that it would be a violation of one of these higher pleasures, is because of the meaning of winning. the meaning of winning is defined separately from the character of pleasure you have. You have a higher pleasure and a higher satisfaction from genuine winning because there's something meaningful to a genuine win, and there's something that perverts the meaning and ruins it when you find out that you won only because someone else threw the game. So it's not the fact that you have the pleasure that's the ultimate truth here. The pleasure has to be more authentic. It has to be connected to a meaningful win. But the more fundamental matter ethically is that the action had to have integrity, and it only makes rational sense for you to take a pleasure in a real victory and not one that was gained by cheating. That's the prior issue.
Mill said some really controversial stuff. And before I get into these quotes, can we all agree he was the worst writer in all of philosophy? Can we agree to that?
No, he's a good one. He's a good one. He's one of the better writers.
Who is this guy? What?
Have you Kant?
He was awful. Okay, Kant sucked. He was a cunt.
Basically, every German was worse than Mill, but
I hated Mill. I still read him because I want to understand him. I love him. But Jesus Christ, was he dry as fuck.
Yeah, not by philosophy standards.
Okay.
Yeah. Man, you got to read some Russell, some Kant. There's some dry stuff.
Okay.
Frege.
Can we agree Nietzsche was the most prolific writer?
Not the most prolific, but an engaging one, yeah.
The most entertaining.
Yeah, he was readable. Right. He didn't bore me.
So Mill said this, that so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the time. That might not apply to today, but it certainly applied to his generation. He also said, I have learned to seek my happiness by limiting my desires rather than in attempting to satisfy them. That's almost leaving Western philosophy and going kind of Eastern. That sounds almost Buddhist, along with the next one. Pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. And let me finish off with this one. Conservatives, this one might make you angry, Evan. Conservatives are not necessarily stupid, but most stupid people are conservatives. Before I let you guys go, I'd really like to get your take on some of these quotes.
Well, first off, the current Republican Party is not even close to conservative. So
Fair.
I'd have to snub my nose at Mill for that one. I don't think a lot of these quotes are sounded very Eastern. I guess that I'm very familiar with the means and ends format that has been in Western philosophy for a while.
Hold on. Limiting your desires equals happiness? You can't say that that's kind of like some kind of Buddhist stuff?
That's Stoicism. So the Stoics said precisely that. And what Mill often did to modify Bentham is instead of appeal to Epicurus like Bentham often did, he appealed to Stoics.
Well, I agree with Mill that if you can maximize your happiness, well, I mean, again, I don't think the ultimate goal is happiness, and not in the subjective sense of happiness, the pleasure states in the brain. I think the ultimate goal is, thriving in your excellences. And if you want to define living well, living in a thriving way as the meaning of eudaimonia, as the way I understand it, then that, if you want to define that as happiness, then I would say, okay, happiness is the goal. If you mean the Aristotelian sort of sense, where happiness is this activity. So I do think ultimately happiness is this activity rather than the subjective states. But insofar as what we're talking about is subjective states, insofar as that is a good we're after, Mill is quite insightful about that. And on this point, I would agree with him that one of the ways to maximize the subjective pleasure that you're going to have is to not aim your energies, not invest yourself in things you don't have or can't have. And so having a clear eye about what's possible and adjusting your expectations to the possible is a better way to have a better pleasure to disappointment ratio, right? Now, what I think people would get anxious about is if you constantly set your sights low, then you might cut off more pleasure. That might be one issue. And people would make objections that there are certain pleasures that can only come from a passionate investment that involves a risk of pain, right? And so there are certain ways of thinking of this that if you're trying to too much hedge your bets, too much limit your desires, you're going to cut yourself off from the pursuit of more ambitious pleasures or the sorts of pleasures that are better, but they involve the risk of pain. So this, the most classic example everyone's familiar with is that, love comes with a risk of pain. And so you could worry that someone who tried to limit their desires so as to always, have a better success ratio and not be as disappointed. Well, someone like that might be inclined to hedge against, taking the risk of loving people, taking the risk of investing in risky projects that might fail because they're so afraid of the disappointment. And so you might say, look, these higher pleasures of achievement or genuine love, they come freighted with this risk of pain. So yeah, don't limit your desires so much that, insulate yourself from pain so much that it means you cut yourself off from the possibility of rich pleasure that comes of love or attainment just because you didn't want to be disappointed. That's the downside of that way of thinking.
Evan, your thoughts on that?
So on higher and lower in particular, these pleasures and dividing the pleasures are really useful for Mill in order to get a lot of this common sense ethics across the board and make it sound super short and sweet. There is a heavily criticized section of this about splitting pleasures like this. So in G.E. Moore's book, Principia Ethica, Moore argues that there's no such thing as a better pleasure unless it's more pleasure. The utilitarian says that they value one thing and one thing only, which is the most happiness to the most number of people. But there seems to be different kinds of happiness here. And it means that Mill is valuing not one thing, but at least two. One of the things that we can ask is what makes a higher pleasure higher than the lower pleasures? And the answer seems to be rationality, which means that Mill is not merely valuing pleasure, but he's also valuing rationality, and he's trying to force that into a utilitarian framework. So other consequentialists that still care about the most good for the most people have now started to object to the most pleasure for the most people, specifically because it looks like there might be multiple values that we could go for.
Gentlemen, we've referenced baseball. I'm going to throw you a softball as we're going out. I would like to hear your response to the trolley car scenario. There's 5 people in front of you on the trolley car track. The trolley is racing toward them. You can pull the lever and it's going to move over to kill 1 person. If you pull that lever, you save 5, but you also become a murderer. What do you do? And after you say what you do, if you don't mind closing us out with how people can find you and your content.
Multi-track drifting.
No, you can't cheat.
Run them all over,
no.
all at once. Pull the lever right after the front wheels
You're
cross.
cheating.
You can get both wheels on both tracks.
This is what Dan talked about, Evan. You're violating utilitarianism. You're violating Dan's ethics. You can't do it.
All right. Let's answer legitimately then. So in the standard trolley problem, I would go ahead and pull the lever. I think it would be better for me to be, maybe even rightly, labeled a murderer because of the other people that are living.
Fair enough. And Evan, where would you direct the listeners today?
So I've been involved in a number of more formal debates that are equally academic, but have more of the old traditional feel to it as well. You can look up these debates by simply Googling my name and the word debate. They should be the first things on YouTube. I should have another one up in November over free will as well. And then you can also check me out at theallianceparty.com. I'm the Texas State Chair for a new centrist party, and we'd love to have your support.
Allianceparty.com. And spell your name real quick for us, just in case.
It's EVANFRISKE.
Thanks, Evan.
Friske.
Okay, well, the trolley problem you gave us is indeed a softball, and that's because you didn't get to the hardball trolley problem, which makes the trolley problem a famous thought experiment instead of just
guy.
One of a million variations on the basic question of whether you kill, whether you're willing to directly kill a person to save people or to not do anything and let more people die. The hard part comes in at the problem of the fat man, right? And so the idea is that if you, it's pretty straightforward. I used to ask my philosophy classes, and they matched the survey data that the philosophers are basing this puzzle off of pretty amazingly. I would ask a room of students, 35 students. You're barreling down the track. You have a switch you can flip, and either if you don't flip it, you're going to barrel into 5 innocent people. And if you do flip the switch, you will get off of that track. You'll hit 1 person. That test is for the question of whether or not it's okay to actively put this one person in harm to let these other 5 people live, or whether it is better to not actively put anyone in harm but passively let the train kill the 5. Out of 35 people, I swear, 30 people would say absolutely flip the switch.
Yeah.
But then the trolley problem is, why do people's intuitions change? As soon as you change the example and say, instead of being in the trolley and being able to flip a switch, let's say you are standing on a footbridge over the track, and there is and there's the only way to stop the trolley that's headed for 5 people is to push a giant fat man, say me, over into the way of the trolley to stop it.
Hold on. Dr. Dan, as Evan recommended we call you, Dr. Dan. Is this not, in the social justice warrior culture, Twitter field that we're in, right? Is this not fat shaming? Was utilitarianism not fat shaming people in a way and killing them as a result?
I don't want to get into.
You don't want to okay, good. Finish your point. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, I mean, it does complicate it if you start saying, yeah, this is because we think fat people's lives are worth less. So that's why I used me, because clearly my life is worth a lot. So the idea here,
Evan and I think so,
is that when you ask that classroom full of people, 30 out of 35 people will say, it's wrong to push the fat man. Absolutely don't do it. And the puzzle is, both cases look like one life versus 5, and both cases are a case of you having to intervene to make something happen, to save 5 at the expense of 1. And if you don't intervene, you let 5 people die. And yet people's intuitions change. And the real nature of the trolley problem is, why do people's intuitions change there? Is there a genuine moral difference between flipping a switch and pushing someone off a bridge? And so that's really what the trolley problem comes down to. And so the harder question to get people to commit to is, will they actually throw the fat man off the bridge? And I think that it's, my inclination is to say, in reality, I wouldn't, because I live in a nation of laws that would not understand that. And there's a reason they wouldn't understand it. And it's because this principle of not directly harming somebody, directly killing them, even if it could theoretically save these more lives, is a really valuable safety net against people trying to make those calculations on their own. Like, it seems like if you're going to make those sorts of trade-offs, they have to be at a much bigger scale, or you have to be somebody who has a good authority to make those sorts of decisions. I think we would really worry if we trained up people who were willing to abandon their don't throw people into harm unless it's an absolute last recourse and there's a great number of people at stake. I think our intuitions about keeping our don't push someone in the way of a train, that to not be able to violate them on that intimate level of actually touching them and throwing them into harm's way. There's a reason we have that strong intuition. I know that it's formally looks the same as pulling the lever, but I wouldn't want to mess with that psychological wiring against hurting the person at hand. And so I think I would rather trust the way we're wired on that one than say, and I know I would never do it. I know if I was standing on that footbridge, there's no way I'm actually pushing somebody. So I can't fantasize I'd be the super consequentialist in theory. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but I guess I tend to err on the side of having strong strictures against thinking we can create the greater good by violating core moral rules. I think we have to have a lot of justification for that. Dr.
Dan, tell everybody how they can find your content and maybe learn a little bit more about philosophy.
You can go to my blog, Camels with Hammers, which I will be updating again any day now, any month now. But it's not dead. I'm on hiatus, but I will be posting again soon, eventually. I've been writing a lot lately, and I'm just trying to think about the best presentation now. And I can be found for my philosophy classes. Email me, camelswithhammers@gmail.com, or friend me on Facebook, Dan Finke, Finke. That's Finke. And that's the best way to find me, is on Facebook. Message me there. Let me know how you found me, and I'll likely friend you. or just email me at camelswithhammers@gmail.com, and I can send you the information for my philosophy classes, and we can have these direct discussions for 2 hours a week about philosophy with a small group of self-motivated, passionate people who love philosophy.
Thank you to Evan and Dan. Thank you to Dave Blair at davefreesong.com/free music. Thank you to Brent Lee from the Unapologetics podcast for making this song.
Right to reason. You're right to reason. You're right to reason. You're right to reason. You're right to reason.
Love it! Find a link to his show and Evan and Dan's content links in today's show notes. Thank you to our patrons. You can also support this broadcast at patreon.com/right and learn more at therighttoreason.com. Next week, I'll be debating Kelly Clemenson. The topic was Jesus Christ, a stupid, evil cult leader. Between now and then, remember that you have the right to reason.
They would then go into the Yankees locker room and say, "Hey guys, I know it's halftime." Or, that's not how it works. Hey guys, it is very easy for me with 2 years of networking to get an angry atheist. It is very easy to get a fundamentalist Christian or a Muslim or a conspiracy theorist. The hardest thing it is for me to get, actually, I was going to say as a philosophy junkie, but the hardest thing is somebody funny, a comedian. But the second hardest thing for me to get is somebody like either of the two of you, and I'm really, really, really grateful.
This has been my pleasure. In fact, it's been higher pleasures than not lower.
Higher pleasure. You both are wrong about John Stuart Mill. God damn it!
He's better than you, and I condemn you both to hell.
You know, for an atheist, it's the devotion thing really well.
Thanks so much, guys.
No problem.
You're welcome. See ya, man.
I'm out of here.